All right, so let's continue on. This should be lecture number 7, I believe, or 8. Either way, we're going to try to probably have 2 more lectures, this lecture and another lecture, to finish up the introduction to evolution for my zoology class, introduction to zoology. And we're going to start thinking about, exam. You'll have take-home questions, and you'll also have some type of online or in-class or oral exam to be determined. So anyway, that is where we're at right now. So we've talked a lot about natural selection and artificial selection. As you can imagine, it can be, you could study this for years, but I'm just beginning to introduce you to. And so when we talk about evolution, we're going to get into some different things, but, just realize Darwin's idea of evolution was through natural selection. But the idea of evolution's been around a long time. Even Lamarck had ideas about evolution before Darwin, but his ideas were acquired characteristics and stuff like that. Now, when we talk about evolution, it's not just going to be related to, when we think about evolution, most people tend to think of it as a macroevolution, this idea of change in species from one species to another species. That's what typically, and if you're really somebody, a lot of people seem to tend to just think of it in regards to humans, even though we're just one species out of billions of species, millions of species of animals. But macroevolution is the evolutionary change on a grand scale. So here we're talking hundreds of thousands of years, usually, even often millions of years before you have speciation. That doesn't mean that it can't happen faster in some cases. Because ultimately, speciation just means that one species may have diverged into 2 different ones, and they're no longer interbreeding with one another. Example of animals that are closely related to one another that can't interbreed anymore would be horses and donkeys. That's an example where the horse and the donkey would have shared a common ancestry, if you can imagine it branching off by fingers representing branching off of a stem, where there was a common ancestor to horse and donkeys. And when they interbreed, what happens? You end up with a mule that's a sterile hybrid, or a ginny, depending on whether it's a male or female and how you do the mating, but that's not the important for this part of what I'm trying to get at. You can understand how a horse and a donkey are closely related to each other. And then over enough evolutionary time, this species diverged into horses and donkeys. And in doing so, they can no longer interbreed with one another and have a fertile offspring. That doesn't mean mules don't live, of course, but mules are not fertile, meaning they're able to have offspring. That's an example of macroevolution, this change in species. Microevolution, as I already mentioned, is evolutionary change on a small scale. So this is things like antibiotic resistance, or having big beaks and little beaks and finches be more selected for a particular food source in the island, or a virus gaining resistance to, or pesticide resistance in insects. I mean, these are all examples of microevolution. But these basic principles reside in ultimately where enough changes can make a new species. So initially, the idea is that donkeys and horses were of the same species, but enough changes occurred because of habitat choice and so forth that eventually these populations diverged, and they had different mating periods and maybe different set of chromosomes, all these kind of mutations and changes occurring over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So again, most creationists probably accept the idea of microevolution. It's something we can see in real time. We can see pesticide resistance or antibiotic resistance, within a span of our own lifetime, watching it happen in bacteria quickly. Because the reason why evolution is so rapid in viruses and bacteria is the fact that they can replicate so quickly. While we're sitting here, bacteria is doubling constantly. If you had some on your skin, for instance, they're doubling and they're going to go through multiple generations. I mean, think about how long it takes for a generation of humans. I mean, most people will get married or not, but they'll breed or mate sometime after their 20s. So 20 years went by before that happened. Bacteria, on the other hand, 20 minutes, they could have gone through a few generations. So that's a big difference in time. So evolution occurs much more rapidly in bacteria and viruses and so forth. Some animals can also undergo big evolutionary changes more rapidly too, because they can lay thousands of eggs, and they can go 3 or 4 generations in a summer, for instance. A typical insect can have multiple generations and multiple, they could be a great-grandfather before the summer's out. So it's a big difference in time. So that's why some things evolve faster than others, some animals. Evolution is when we're talking about changes in gene frequency. Again, genes are the blueprints inside your cells for making proteins, and then that's what gives us our traits. One set comes from your mother, one set comes from your father. And so let's say you have a gene that gives you blue eyes, or let's say you got a trait that gives you curly hair. You're passing that on to your offspring. And if for some reason curly hair was just an amazing trait for giving you fitness, there's going to be a lot more curly haired kids down the road, just for example. Silly example, that's hypothetical. Okay, so evidence for evolution, meaning primarily macroevolution, when we're talking about here, is going to be the fossil record, anatomical record, and molecular record. The fossil record, again, is going to be found by looking for fossils. A lot of times this is paleontologist. If you look at a canyon, and you can imagine the Grand Canyon or lots of different canyons, or even driving around, you'll see different sediment layers. And it takes a long time for the sediment layers. There's erosion and there's buildup of soils and reduction of soils and so forth that occur year after year. It's kind of like growth rings on a tree in a sense. But these sediment layers can end up being thousands of years of buildup or reduction. And so if an animal dies on the top layer, of course, this is where they'll get covered with mud or whatever and become a fossil. Fossils are still a pretty rare event, especially for soft-bodied animals. Hard-shelled animals fossilize better, as you can imagine. So as you scrape through these layers, the top layers are more related to species that live today. Like here's this snail-like shell that we can find. But if you go further down into these sedimentary layers, we start seeing fossils of very old animals. In some cases that no longer, and in most cases, no longer exist. And so we don't find, for instance, this fossil is usually at the top layers, especially if they've gone extinct. So this gives us an idea of these different time periods, like Cambrian time period and Jurassic time period and Cretaceous and other ones that you can imagine. So at the bottom layers, you're going to see much more simple animals, and the animals that are more like ourselves are going to be at the higher layers. So younger stratum has more recent fossils, older stratum has older fossils. And paleontologists who've spent their lifetime studying this stuff over many generations have gotten really good at being able to predict what kind of fossils they'll find in certain areas. So the fossil record provides examples of animals that are no longer living. And they also provide examples of animals that help us to understand evolution. For instance, over here, we have a feathered dinosaur, Archaeopteryx. This is found in Berlin, and sometimes you can see they make little feather-like projections coming out of the bones, but this is actually not a bird. You can see that this isn't really a formed beak. It has more of a teeth-like substance. And a lot of times they were flightless. And it doesn't, and again, most dinosaurs didn't evolve and have feathers, but this particular class, there's a particular class or two of dinosaurs did form these feathers. Some of them have been fossilized. And so this gives us evidence that some dinosaurs evolved into what we call birds today. Remember, dinosaurs lay eggs and they could have been colorful and all sorts of different things. But a group of them did have these feathers. And it's not sure if these feathers helped to provide warmth, some gliding, maybe escaping a predator by jumping, kind of fluttering up. There's all sorts of different ideas about how flight may have evolved in vertebrates, animals with backbones. Sometimes we have living fossils like this coelacanth, which is a fish that they thought was extinct because they'd only seen it in the fossil record. But outside off the coast of Africa, there was actually examples of these fish that were caught. So they're almost like a living fossil. It gives you an idea of when plants evolved and from fall, the idea is that plants initially were like mostly ferns and then they became fern-like trees. And then flowering plants came much later. And we get an idea of when all this happens by looking at when they show up in the fossil record on which layer and then which animals happen to be associated with it. So this is how we're able to kind of piece together life's history on Earth. Again, it's people that have dedicated their lives and, every day they're thinking about this kind of stuff. Little armies of them. So again, it's not a good idea just to poo-poo it. I mean, I think that's the one thing that bothers me about creationists or people that don't have a very strong science background. They just kind of dismiss this work of people that are very smart, that spent enormous amounts of their lives trying to figure this out and then passing it on to students that then spend the rest of their life trying to figure it out. But at least you understand when people say we think birds evolved from dinosaurs, there's a reason for it because of what we've seen in the fossil record. Paleontology was largely developed by a French scientist named Georges Cuvier. He advocated for catastrophism. And he speculated that each boundary of strata represented a catastrophe. His ideas are probably a little bit simplistic. While there are catastrophes that happen that may have, that wiped out the dinosaurs and things like that. Again, this is back when science was just getting off the ground, so to speak, no pun intended. Then geologists such as James Hutton and Charles Lyell perceived that the changes in Earth's history or Earth's surface can result from slow, continuous actions still operating today. So in other words, the idea is that what was happening on Earth's history, the erosion processes, the buildup of sediment, how long does it take for all this to happen in volcanoes, is a very slow process that can be measured and provide some prediction of what rate it would take to do so, and that the laws and the rules on how the Earth worked has basically been the same since the Earth's formation. So Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism states that the mechanisms of change are constant over time. So what this did for Darwin is it gave Darwin the framework that the Earth is very old. It takes a long time for changes to take place. So that's where Darwin starts to think, oh, the Earth, if Earth really has this ancient history, then there is enough time for things to change and evolve. So this is how another field of science helps to influence biology. Now remember, there was different ideas about evolution that occurred even before Lamarck and Darwin. Now I've already talked about this. Lamarck hypothesized that species evolved through the use and disuse, so they either use it or lose it, of body parts and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. But remember, for the most part, evolution does not work this way. There's some leeway if you know a little bit about epigenetics and stuff like that that we're not going to get into. But generally speaking, a giraffe does not stretch its neck and over time pass on that aptitude to its offspring. What happens is, as Darwin indicated, there's a wide range of giraffes with various lengths of necks, and those with the taller necks had a higher probability of survival because they ate more and reproduced more. That's what we call fitness. In fact, Darwin never used the word survival of the fittest. Darwin did not say that. There was some other person that brought that up. It was coined, I can't remember now right offhand, I think Herbert Spencer or something like that, but I might be off on that. But again, that's a misconception because fitness just means who can survive and adapt to its environment. It isn't who can run the fastest or something like that. So again, Lamarckian ideas are for the most part not really supported, but Darwin's ideas have been. Now the fossil records are always going to be a little bit incomplete. Fossils are rare, but people that study fossils get an idea of how maybe something like this horse-like animal could have evolved from something that, at least from these pictures, looks a little hippo-like. And I'm not saying it's a hippo, it's a titanothere or something of that nature. But the idea is that they found fossils of this. They study the bones of these fossils and they get an idea of the similarity between them, and then they find these other fossils that kind of fit this picture. That doesn't mean that they're going to absolutely be correct. But there's reason to believe that these fossils were related to one another. And look in the history of these fossils, they can see that this one came before this one, 35 million years ago versus 40 million years ago, and so forth, and get an idea of how these animals may have evolved. I think this actually looks like it's flip-flopped. This should be 50 million years down to 35 million years. Since this is the more extant looking species, I think this picture may be a little off, in my opinion. What about dolphins, whales? How do they evolve? Well, first of all, you need to realize dolphins and whales are mammals. Why are they mammals? They have hair and fur. Might not be very obvious, but they have a little bit. They also provide milk to their offspring. They have mammary glands. They're warm-blooded. What else does mammals have? Live birth. And so from an evolutionary perspective, these mammals evolved from animals that walked on land and then evolved to be able to live in the ocean. Some animals have, like seals and sea lions. You can see how they have had a terrestrial backgrounds because they kind of go to the sea and come back from the sea. So they evolved the ability to do that. But the idea is that these animals, excuse me, these animals here lived on land. Why do they think that they're related to the whales? It's because of their skull shape. And you can see there's some pretty complex scientific names that I'm going to butcher. But here's Plactus actica or something like that. But anyway, the skull has kind of a shape that suggests it's similar to and moved and evolved into what we see here. Again, this is probably a well worked out idea, but it's not a perfect idea. The fossils aren't perfect. There are various steps that we don't know about, but we do have fossils of this animal here and fossils of this animal here, and they appear to become more whale-like over time, or dolphins, whales, porpoises, whatever, over time. And you should obviously be able to tell that a dolphin and a killer whale were probably related at one time down the road. And other whales were related to other whales. And then they evolved with different evolutionary paths. But the idea is that these mammals evolved from animals that lived on land first. Let's look at a video that can help depict how this may have happened. But here's, again, what they found in the skeletons. You can see how it's kind of this shape. And then here we have, and again, these are animals that are no longer living, right? I mean, but they have flipper-like tails, and then the tails become more important for swimming, and they lose their legs. They become more vestigial. And even if you look at this whale here, you can still, if you look at the skeleton, you can still see a vestigial bone, suggesting it's a relationship to having legs. Even its flippers and fins are modified forelegs. So let's take a look at a video of how paleontologists believe or think this species of whales evolved from this species here, and the different missing links and so forth. Again, there's no absolute proof. They are, like a detective, piecing together these fossils and saying, hey, look, this is kind of similar to this. So this is what I think happened. That's what's happening. And again, but I don't think it's right to dismiss it. These are extremely intelligent people that really know this stuff. They study these same bones every day, you can imagine, often. And they have some pretty good ideas of what may be happening. Not perfect, but really great ideas. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video on that. So this video, again, is providing you an idea based on the fossil record and how paleontologists that specialize in this area speculate whales may have evolved. So there's these land creatures. They see that they have some adaptations that look aquatic. So here's another fossil they find. And the head starts shaping a little differently. The legs look more modified for swimming. And then they find another fossil that of an animal that's even more swimming-like. And again, these animals don't exist anymore. They haven't existed for millions of years. But the fossils were found for these animals. And then here's another set of fossils. And again, there's no evidence that this fossil necessarily evolved into this fossil, but they believe that they may have shared a more recent, some type of common ancestry, right? We don't know exactly who and what, but that they shared an ancestry of some sort. And then, of course, we see modern whales and so forth. So going along with that theme, in Tokyo, Japanese researchers said on Sunday that a bottlenose dolphin was captured last month and has an extra set of fins that could be the remains of back legs. And so here's those extra fins. Again, normally all you find is a little nugget of bone that's under the skin, but these ones actually protruded, but you don't normally see. So if you go to the Shed Aquarium, you're not going to normally see these fins. So these ones happen to sprout. Sometimes humans even have little tails. We have a little tailbone. Sometimes they protrude a little bit in rare and extreme cases. So anyway, these extra set of fins are providing evidence that in the genetic code, there was still some information on how to make the leg. So a lot of DNA, you know, those recipes are so ancient and hidden inside our DNA. That doesn't mean that it's all completely there, but there was some DNA that said to make this leg or make this tail a little longer. That's all that really takes place is these mutations change over time. And then in some cases, the mutations leads to something that's extreme. Again, it's hard for our brain to really wrap around what's happening over millions of years. What kind of selection can take place? I mean, it's hard to even imagine. You know, we live in a world where we're lucky if we make 100 years, or not lucky, depending on the case. And even around this town in Macomb, a lot of changes have happened, little things. So imagine what happens, and then even think about United States history and what's happened over the last couple of 100 years. In fact, we didn't even have this technology that exists, even though when I was born, that allows me to do this presentation this way and this conveniently. So things are changing all the time, and sometimes it's beyond a perception. Now, can you imagine what happens in millions of years? I can't even wrap my head around that. But anyway, this is providing evidence that dolphins had this land evolutionary history. What else provides evidence? We already talked about this earlier, embryology. Here are all these different embryos. They all look very similar. Again, showing that they're all related to one another. They all have gill slits. Here's a human with a little tail, limb buds. Not a whole lot different than a bird. Again, they all have the backbone and the vertebrates. Here's a fish. Here's a reptile. Again, this is the kind of stuff that suggests we shared an ancestor. Here we share a same developmental appearance at some level, because we have a lot of the same genes making the same stuff. Look, even a chick embryo that lives in an egg versus a human embryo. And if I showed you this, you wouldn't have known it was a human necessarily. Here's a post-anal tail on a human. Humans evolved from animals that have tails. Monkeys have tails. Apes don't. We don't. Chimpanzees don't have tails. Not maybe a little tailbone like we have. But look at this. Here is a chicken, and the basic structures are similar. And then it goes off and does its own thing, and and the genes tell it to form, let these bones grow longer in the case of a bat. I mean, it's just that's basically what's happening. We got a handful of genes telling our head to get bigger and so forth. What kind of anatomical evidence exists for evolution? Well, vestigial organs can often be evidence for evolution, like having a short tailbone. The fact that our appendix is so reduced in humans where it's becoming vestigial, it may have some function, minor functions. But and of course we have, sometimes people have appendicitis and they have to remove the appendix. But in apes, the appendix is actually quite large in comparison to humans. And I believe it holds a sack of digestive bacteria or something like that in apes. So apes have much larger appendix system than ourselves, but and ours is reduced. We have a omnivore diet. So again, vestigial organs provide evidence that we evolved from an animal that had this big appendix, and now we have a small appendix. Molecular evidence also provides evidence for evolution, and I've talked about this already at the beginning of this lecture series, how we can look at the genes or the proteins or the amino acids in a protein and look at the differences and map them out. So if you look at this, this is the number of amino acids difference between this hemoglobin polypeptide and a human one. Now, just to make sure you understand, hemoglobin is a protein found in red blood cells that holds oxygen. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and polypeptides are the chains that we call these proteins. Because they're made up of peptides, amino acids have peptides that join each other. And so the more closely related they look morphologically, meaning how they look, corresponds to how closely similar their red blood protein is, the hemoglobin, how similar it is to it. So for instance, the human and the macaque, which is a type of monkey, they have 8 hemoglobins, 8 amino acids difference in this hemoglobin. And I'm assuming hemoglobin probably has 1,000 something amino acids or more. I don't know exactly how many amino acids needed to make a hemoglobin. Could be tens of thousands. I'm not really sure. But the point is 8 hemoglobins difference between macaques and humans. And if you look at it morphologically, that macaque looks a lot more like that human than that frog does. I mean, whether you accept evolution or not, you got to at least accept that that macaque looks a lot more like that human. And if we look at the molecular, their proteins, they're also much more similar. What about dogs and macaques and humans? Well, dogs are mammals, fur, hair, warm-blooded, mammals, milk, live births. That's a heck of a lot more similar to us, humans, live births, hair, mammary glands, warm-blooded, than a bird or a frog. Frogs lay eggs, or birds lay eggs. Birds can be warm-blooded, but they are definitely further apart from us evolutionarily. So if you look at dogs, they have 32 amino acids different than ourselves. Birds, 45. Frogs, 67. And again, these are all vertebrates that are closely related to one another. Now, lampreys are a prehistoric fish, and they have 120, they're very old, ancient fish, and they have 125 amino acids difference in comparison to humans. Morphologically, a lot different than humans. So again, this is the, and I'm sure if I said which ones are more similar, humans and macaques or humans and dogs, you would say macaques. I'd say what's more similar, humans and dogs and humans and birds, you would say the dog. I said humans and frogs and humans and lampreys, you would say the frog, because frogs have limbs like this and hearts and lungs, and this are more similar to us than this lamprey. And on a molecular scale, they're much more similar as well. So the molecular record also provides evidence for evolution. And it's not just hemoglobin. Even here's hemoglobin right here. Every 100 amino acids represents, roughly, and hemoglobin would represent, so this is the number of amino acid changes per 100 amino acids. So here, if you had 120 amino acids difference, they would argue that that molecular clock would say there was over 600 million years that have gone by between lampreys and humans. So lampreys and humans are likely 600 million years apart when they shared a common ancestor. And that depends on the proteins. That's for hemoglobin. For cytochrome C, which doesn't evolve as fast, 40 amino acids represents, or 20 or 30 amino acids represent 600 million years. Hemoglobin evolves faster as a protein, 100 amino acids. So just realize different proteins, the number of amino acids difference is how that molecular clock, some clocks run faster than other clocks. But once you figure out the rate, and again, these are extremely smart people that put this together. It's not just one guy. We're talking teams of people that have done this kind of work and argued with each other and speculated and verified and tested. So different proteins evolve at different times, and we call that a molecular clock. So again, evolution is a great tool for helping us to understand and ask questions. And these are just crazy questions I threw up there, but evolution helps provide an answer for it. I mean, why is there hairy elephants in northern Russia? Why was there woolly mammoths? Now, granted, I'm talking about prehistoric when I say northern Russia, because we don't have hairy elephants now in northern Russia. I'm talking about mammoths, mastodons and stuff. Why did they, I've been going back to them, but why do they exist? Because we had an ice age. You can put an evolutionary story to this. Might not be the most correct one, but you can at least come up with a conjecture. I mean, why is there white rabbits and polar bears in the Arctic when the environment is covered with snow? But down here we have brown rabbits. We have grizzly bears that live in the mountains here, not in Illinois, of course. But there used to be a lot more bears and black bears running around in Illinois. We still had one that ran through last summer. We have bears in Missouri, and we used to have a lot more. But why is it? The environment is different here. In the fall, it's going to be very brown here. Being a brown covered animal helps you to hide during a brown fall. What about antibiotic resistance? If you don't believe in evolution, you probably don't really think about antibiotic resistance. And if not, you accept microevolution, well then what's there to stop it in a million years being macroevolution and speciation? So again, evolution is a helpful tool for figuring out insecticide resistance, bacterial resistance, and domestication. Domestication is where we selected animals through what we call artificial selection, so we can have plants that we like to eat that didn't just show up as broccoli. That corn that you see when you're driving around did not exist like that. except from the selection of early farmers. Often, sometimes, a lot of times, it was believed to be the females were doing a lot of the farming in ancient times that helped to cultivate that grass into what we call corn, because it is a grass species of some sort. And then, of course, modern times, we're just taking it to another extreme with seed companies making hybrids every year and then genetically engineering them. But we domesticated cows, we domesticated dogs, we domesticated cats to some degree. And the difference between taming and domestication is that we bred and artificially selected them. There has been some studies where Russian scientists domesticated foxes. And when he domesticated the foxes, they started becoming puppy-like. Let's see if I can find a video on that. Okay, so here is domestication of foxes.
In 1959, the Russian zoologist Dmitry Belyov started one of the longest-running scientific studies on canine domestication. Belyov began with 130 silver foxes that lived on a commercial fur farm in Estonia. Belyov selected foxes that display tameness toward humans. Only the tamest of these foxes, 20 to 25%, were selected to breed the next generation of tame fox kits.
So there we have artificial selection. The scientist bred only the most docile of the foxes, and the rest of the population he just left alone. And he took this group and inbreed them for domestication.
Let's follow what Belyov and his scientists observed after breeding tame foxes with one another for over 40 generations.
40 generations.
In the first generation, the researchers would have seen foxes which look very much like their wild relatives. Wild silver fox ears stand upright on their head immediately after birth, and their tails point downward. Their hair is brown at the base and silver black tipped along the hair follicle.
So obviously the first generations, they don't look much any different than the foxes in the wild.
Young foxes begin to wag their tail in response to humans.
And so after more generations, we start to see more of the behaviors that they're after, more friendliness, more, something that you'd want as a pet, basically.
And approach them voluntarily. These foxes are also more amicable.
So that means that the behaviors can evolve too. Good-natured foxes breeding with other good-natured foxes tend to have good-natured offspring. Angry foxes breeding with other angry foxes tend to have angry foxes. It's not a good thing, but there's dog breeding that was meant to make dogs that were aggressive guard dogs, or dogs that were, good fighting dogs, hunting dogs. We bred those behaviors, reinforcing them by breeding the best of those traits that we wanted with the best of the other traits we wanted. Females with really good sniffers and males with really good sniffers were brought together to make the bloodhounds. We bred those traits, or we bred them to be chihuahuas that would sit in your purse.
To human interaction, allowing themselves to be pet and carried by a human while creating whimpering vocalizations.
It's not just taming. That's the thing I want you to understand. It's not just taking a wild fox and taming it. They bred foxes to the point where they started having puppy-like behaviors that stayed as an adult. They actually call that neoteny.
By the sixth generation, we see that several individuals show full affinity to humans, seeking proximity with them and engaging in other social behavior, such as sniffing and licking experimenters, just like domestic dogs.
So as soon as 6 generations, they're more friendly than their adult counterparts, or the original stock generation.
Longer periods of time, up to 3 months. Foxes in the 13th generation begin to display another trait common in domestic dogs: tails rolled in a circle. The tail of a wild fox points downward, whereas the farm fox's tails curl upwards, especially when in the presence of a human. After 15 to 20 breeding generations, foxes began to be born with shorter tails. Researchers even noted foxes that had tails between 3 to 6 vertebrae shorter in length than their wild fox relatives.
So here we are starting to see true morphological changes in the tail. The tail's actually changing based on the breeding. It wasn't like they were planning that to happen. It's just what happened by their selective breeding. So instead of being like natural selection, they've taken over that selection, and they don't. It's not like they're planning this to happen. It's what's happening based on how it's selected. And the thing is, it's happening so quickly.
After years of breeding tame foxes with one another, the researchers had officially created a new breed, the Russian domesticated red fox. In 1999, 70 to 80% of the experimentally selected fox population were classified as domesticated. Domesticated foxes display a variety of coat colors, from the piebald coloration characteristic to all domestic species, to variations on the original classic red fox coloration, and various combinations of silver and white patterns. These foxes have short tails that curl upwards, as seen in other domestic dog breeds, such as the Shiba Inu. These individuals are friendly, docile, and social, often displaying attention-seeking behavior towards humans, such as playing, whimpering, licking, and nuzzling. The behavioral and physical. How did a wolf turn into a pug? Or an African wildcat into a Maine Coon cat? Next time you interact with a domesticated animal, think about the behavioral and physical changes that had to occur over generations of breeding to produce the animal you see today.
So again, you can see how domestication led to new species. Wolves evolving into dogs. That doesn't mean that dogs and wolves can't interbreed, but they have gone through speciation where some preferred breeding choices, not the preferred mating choices. So again, some strong evidence for evolution in humans' lifetimes. Not one human, but more. Well, I mean, the breeding experiments for the foxes were moving towards speciation. Let's go back to our slides. Okay, so those are some examples of evolution. And there's been other examples where we've seen evolution occurring in various examples. Let me give you a couple of them. Some are related to the color of guppies, and some are related in predation, and some of them are related to drug resistance. Here's some examples of evolutionary change that's been directly observed, or we've studied it as scientists and observed it. Again, these might be more of examples of some microevolution. Okay, so let's talk about predation in guppies. I believe that's what this is again. And here's the kind of setup that we have. We have in one pool, and this is found in the wild, pools, so it's not swimming pools, obviously, like ponds and stuff like that, little pools of water. Some pools have low predation, meaning that there's no predators running around like little pikes eating them. There's no other chomping fish running around. Okay, so in low predation pools, the males display gaudy colors and spots. What does that mean? They're very colorful. They kind of stand out. They're obnoxious in colorfulness. That's what we mean by gaudy. And they reproduce at late age, and they attain a larger adult size before they breed. So this is what happens to guppies in pools that have no predators around. Colorful, and they produce more offspring, and they do so at a larger size, the males. In high predation environments, they exhibit drab coloration. Why is that? Well, the guppies don't want to be eaten, so they're more camouflaged. They reproduce at a younger stage and at a relatively smaller stage because they need to get it done, because they could become a meal very quickly to some other fish. So this is the phenomenon that some scientists have seen. They've seen colorful, gaudy guppies when the predation rate was low, and then they see very drab and camouflaged looking guppies in pools where there's predators swimming around. So what would happen if you moved these fish and flipped them into different pools or added a predator, and then look at it over time? What would happen to those pools? What would you predict? Well, here's how the experiment was set up. So they had guppies in these different pools. Some pools had predators, some didn't. And so the experimental transplant of guppies. So in some places, the predator was a killifish that preys mainly on juvenile guppies, which do not express the color genes. So adult males have bright colors than those of the pike cichlid pool. So in other words, these guppies tended to be more colorful. Pools with no killifish, but no guppies, or prior to transplanting, means that we have colorful guppies. And then we have another predator called a pike cichlid that preys mainly on adult guppies. So the males are drab in color than those in the killifish pool. So that means the guppies here are very colorful. The guppies here are pretty colorful, but the guppies here are not colorful. So then they transplanted guppies in these different pools, or the predators, I'm not sure exactly. But what happens is, in the source population, initially they were drab, and then when they're transplanted to a spot where there was no predators or fewer predators or whatever, they became more colorful over time. They had more spots and they were more colorful. So the original population is this pike cichlid pool. The guppies in there were not very colorful, they were drab. They put them into these pools and they became more colorful over time. And then if they flip-flopped it, they became less colorful over time. So Endler transferred brightly colored guppies to a pool with many predators. As predicted, over time, the population became less colored. Endler, who's the scientist, also transferred drab-colored guppies with many predators to a pool with fewer predators, and then they became more colorful over time. And again, it wasn't Lamarckian. It wasn't like they chose to become more colorful. What happened was they that the offspring was a variety of colorful and not colorful. And so here's the spots of fish in no predation or low predation, they became more colorful. In high predation, they became less colorful. And it wasn't in the individual. Keep that in mind. It's in the population. So the population started off with around 12 spots. You put them into a pool with predators. Over time, because they reproduce and they leave offspring, the offspring that were colorful were eaten. The offspring that weren't colorful reproduced. And then those drab colored guppies continue becoming more drab color because that's all that survived. While if you put them in a low predator environment, the number of spots actually increased. So these experiments were done in field and labs, and I'm sure this person, Inler, in his lab, studied this for probably 20 to 30 years of that lab's lifetime. What about evolution and drug resistance and HIV? Well, HIV is still a serious virus, obviously, that can cause AIDS. But now it's not the death sentence it was when I was growing up in the 80s. We've gotten much better at how we use drugs and what drugs are available. Some of the drugs interfere with the virus's ability to replicate by causing errors in the DNA. What this virus does is unique. This is a retrovirus, and the reason why they call it a retrovirus is it uses reverse transcriptase, and this is something you might not be familiar with that much. But normally, if you remember this from biology in high school, DNA is transcribed into messenger RNA. Well, in the case of these viruses, they're RNA viruses, and they actually use reverse transcription to go from RNA to DNA. So some individual viruses have variation that allows them to produce DNA without errors. These viruses have greater reproductive success. Excuse me. And so initially, what I'm saying is initially this drug was really good at knocking down the virus. So the percent of HIV resistance to this drug 3TC was lower in the first couple of weeks that the patients received it. So that means 75%, 25% showing resistance to the virus, to this drug, and so forth. But the problem is 4 weeks later, the population of viruses were resistant to 3TZ. So what does that mean? That drug was no longer effective because the viruses that could survive the drug survived and replicated and became the predominant population. Now, how do they combat this? One of the ways they do this is they take the patient off that drug, then the virus begins to evolve back to its natural state, or to the state before the drug was present. And then they can bombard the patient with the drug again, and it's effective again for another few weeks. So they're cycling the drug. And that seems to help, at least in some cases. But again, remember, the ability of bacteria and viruses to evolve is dramatically faster than humans and other animals evolve, because literally a virus is replicating thousands of new viruses all the time. That's why it's so dang hard to fight them evolutionarily, because they're evolving so quickly. So this drug, in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, was no longer effective. Because what this drug did was it interfered with the virus's ability to make good DNA from RNA. But some had an advantage. They had maybe a little bit different enzyme that allowed them to replicate a little bit better even in the presence of that drug. And off they went, and they became the predominant population. Again, if they cut the drug, sometimes the virus may lose that ability to fight that drug, and then it becomes susceptible again, just based on selection. So in a 3T, a patient is the environment. You give them the drug. That's what's selecting. Again, we're looking at gene changes in gene frequency. Genes are the blueprints for making proteins. The frequency is how often we see them. An allele is a variant of that gene. So we have tall alleles and short alleles in pea plants, if you remember Mendel et al. Blue eyes and brown eyes, those are alleles. Curly hair versus straight hair, those are alleles. They're variances of the gene. Some people have straight hair alleles and some people have curly hair alleles. Some alleles are dominant traits and some are recessive traits. But selection, evolutionary selection, microevolution specifically, is affected by looking at, it's selecting for these genes, these alleles. And so in the case of domestication of the fox, the curly tail, the floppy ears, the nice demeanor, those genes were being selected at a higher rate for that population. And it's not going to usually be one gene. It could be multiple genes that are being selected for. So an allele is an alternative form of that genetic character. As I said, straight hair versus curly hair, usually found on different chromosomes on any given location. And natural selection and evolution and artificial selection are selecting those traits, those genes out of the environment. Mutations are making more of these different types and variations that then get screened and selected for. So if looking at the phenotypes of cats, and again, this might be an oversimplification of how they get their coloration, but we have white cats and black cats, and the black fur is the dominant trait. The white fur is the recessive trait. So we can have what we call homozygous, meaning the same gene for the allele. Black cats, we can have heterozygous because they have both alleles. I'm hoping this is a little bit of review, but we'll get into it when we talk about genetics later. Or they might be just recessive. And point is evolution still works even though based on our understanding of Mendelian genetics. So what happens now if this cat population lived in the Arctic in a snowy environment? Then these allele frequencies would show up more often because these cats would be eaten or wouldn't be able to prey as well. If you want to be as good predators, they're showing house cats here, but a hypothetical cat was able to live in the Arctic. This frequency of that population would show up more often. Little b, irrespective of the Punnett square, because even though these traits show up and we have heterozygous individuals, when we do the Punnett square, it's these individuals that would predominantly survive, the white-furred cats. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that it's the frequency of genes that show up in a population over time that are being selected. And so evolution isn't just natural selection. It's not just artificial selection. These other factors go into evolution. One is mutations. This is where new varieties come in. How do we get mutations? You know, when you think about have you ever, when you watch your X-Men, the idea is that they had mutations in their genes that gave them these special superpowers. But X mutations do occur. Most mutations are harmful. Most of them are harmful. But every now and then a mutation can actually be beneficial. How else does evolution work? Migration. We'll get into these other ones. Genetic drift, non-random mating, and of course selection, natural selection or artificial selection. So what are mutations? Mutations are errors in DNA replication. What is DNA replication? It's when the DNA is, your cells are constantly synthesizing new DNA inside the nucleus. And every time that happens, there's a copying error. So imagine if you're sitting there writing down someone else's homework, you might make a little error. You might have put a wrong letter in. That might make a mutation, because that's what's happening here. The DNA is being written over and over and over again in your cells. And different things can cause mutation. Sometimes it's just a simple error caused by the cell. Other times it's things like UV light. UV light can cause mutations that lead to skin cancer. Some mutations, though, if they're found in your sex cells or whatever, can lead to new variations, new varieties. So again, mutations are what leads to new traits, new different types of proteins over long enough periods of time. Migration is movement from one area to an area of another area. Some of it is known as immigration, and some of it known as immigration and emigration. So immigration is when individuals are moving into our population. So obviously humans, we can think of immigration when we have people from different countries moving to the United States. We're a very, melting pot or salad, however you want to call it. But we have lots of different people from lots of different areas living here. And that's going to affect our population. There's obviously people getting it on from all sorts of backgrounds. That's just an easy example to think of from a human perspective. Think about it from an animal perspective. If these animals move from one location to another and start, two very closely related species get together, they're going to have the population's going to change. There's going to be interbreeding, or if a population leaves. So those are things that the point is that those are things that affect evolution. Again, it's just easy to talk about humans, but the idea is humans migrated out of Africa. And then now we have lots of immigration and emigration. So populations are moving around, people are getting back together. That's just easy for you to think about it, because you don't, to describe this bee might be a little bit harder to imagine. What about genetic drift? Again, what I'm trying to get at is these are all things that influence evolution. And how's it influencing evolution? It changes the gene frequency in a population over time. Immigration, having new breeding individuals coming into a population or leaving a population, influence the genes that are coming into that population. What about founder effects and things like that? This is something that we see often with island effects, and Darwin saw this kind of stuff. So we have birds being blown off from the mainland to an island. All the species, this is the same species in this picture right now being represented in this diagram. There's a lot of color variations in this species of bird. But imagine only the red ones get blown off to this island. Although they just end up inbreeding more and more, and so they end up as these red birds primarily. So that is an example of how sometimes random things influence evolution. It's not just natural selection. It's not just artificial selection. It's immigration, migration. It's going to be new mutations. It's going to be things like this founder effect, when a small group leaves a bigger group and interbreeds by themselves. So they're no longer sharing genes with the mainland. They're just interbreeding with themselves. So they're losing these gene variations over here. And then we also see that a bottleneck effect. Let's say all of a sudden a hurricane came along and killed off just the red birds, even though they're all the same species. Again, it's just a freak accident, but now the population is much smaller and they're interbreeding, so now the birds are mostly yellow. Had nothing to do with natural selection in that case. It was just a freak kind of thing where the population suddenly dropped. We're seeing a bottleneck effect in things like cheetahs, where the diversity of cheetahs is now very selected. They're almost like clones. We see this also with an animal called the Tasmanian devil that had such a severe bottleneck that they're all practically clones with one another from all the inbreeding, to the point that they can have a cancer on their face, and through fighting, they can actually spread the cancer onto another Tasmanian devil. See, the thing is I could take a cancer cells from my body when I was sick and put them in your body, and your body would react to them and know 99% likelihood that they don't belong in their body, and they would kill my cancer cells that were placed into your body through a blood transfusion, because we're different enough genetically. But in the case of the Tasmanian devil, they had such a severe bottleneck and so much inbreeding that they're genetically nearly identical. So if they were to take the blood of one Tasmanian devil with cancer and put it into another, that cancer would start growing in their body, because they don't know that their bodies wouldn't know the difference between their body and another body. They're essentially clones. So this is one example, a severe example of how bottlenecking. So this is kind of, not only was this a founder effect, we're getting kind of a bottleneck effect here because of the severe change in population size. Kind of go hand in hand a little bit in this particular example. So evolution through non-random mating, inbreeding, mating with the relatives. So those birds here are going to be very closely related to one another. We're going to have inbreeding. Inbreeding doesn't always result in genetic disorders. There is a higher probability, but it's not always as crazy as it sounds. Like you might, the stereotypes of inbreeding. But what happens is we have an increase in homozygosity. What does homozygosity mean? It means it has the same genes. When we inbreed, we're having more and more of the same genes amplified in that population. It's through outbreeding that we bring in more diversity, right? So if you just have one group of, sometimes if you have a small group of islanders and they're just all interbreeding over long periods of time, they're going to be more and more closely related to each other. They're going to see homozygosity in that population. And then someone from an outside population comes in and starts breeding with the population. They're bringing in new genes and new variations and varieties to that population. So that's increasing diversity. And generally speaking, increasing diversity is good for a species. Being too much of a clone usually can result in extinction. So the cheetahs are actually in danger of being extinct, not just from habitat loss and other things, but by the fact that a disease could wipe them out. They don't have enough variation in their diversity in their population to possibly survive something like that. The Tasmanian devils are in danger of going extinct. Diversity actually increases a population's chance of surviving, evolving, and adapting. So the outbreeding and things like that, I would argue, is a good thing. Selection, obviously, we've already discussed this quite a bit. Artificial selection, humans are selecting, natural selection, the environment is selecting. This bird is choosing, in quotes, choosing to eat what it finds first. Okay, so that is a good place to stop. The next lecture will probably wrap up these notes. So we're not going to be far behind having to start thinking about an exam over the first section. A lot of stuff. Make sure that you are, I'm going to give you some pretty big assignments on this and really soon, probably with this, because we're getting near the end of this lecture. I really need to know that you're learning this material. I'm hoping that if you're missing something, you're not just breezing through my lectures, that you're actually going back through and thinking about what's being said. It's going to be a lot. You don't want to wait till the last minute. So what do I need today? I want you to write another nearly one-page summary, single space summary of what you learned. I want you to explain some of the evidence that you found for evolution, provide some examples. I want you to talk about the molecular stuff, the anatomical stuff, some of the direct observations of evolution that we have. I want you to talk about how evolution occurs. And remember, it's not just natural selection, it's not just selection, it's all these other factors as well. Where does new variations come from? Mutations. They change the genes. How do we get different genes coming in a population? Migration, right? Immigration, immigration, genetic drift, and we have the bottlenecks and stuff like that. And then we have non-random mating. We haven't got into it, but there's other reasons for non-random mating. Some of it's selection. Sometimes it's bottlenecking, sometimes it's sexual selection. But there's a lot of different factors involved. Anyway, that wraps up this set of notes. And then I think the next set of notes will finish up our introduction to evolution, and then we'll start moving into, I believe, cell biology. All right, well, thank you for your attention. I hope you're getting a better appreciation for evolution. Take care.